What if the simplest scene in American political history, a Brooklyn grandmother narrating the tour of her own childhood home in 1969, was actually the most carefully constructed lie she ever told? America had been given the version where Rose Kennedy absorbed every tragedy like weather. A rosary, a soft face, a widow who never complained. If this opening pulled you off the couch for even a second, hit like and pass it to one friend who still believes that picture. They will want the next 25 minutes. To see the woman on that recording, you have to back up to the moment before the Kennedys existed as a brand, before the White House and the Senate and the magazine covers, all the way to a Dorchester brownstone in the 1890s where a girl named Rose Fitzgerald first understood what a family's public face costs the person holding it. Her father, John Francis Fitzgerald, was Honey Fitz, the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston and the loudest mayor any Boston Irish voter could remember. Her mother, Josephine Hannon, was quieter and sicker than her husband, and from around the age of 16, Rose had started substituting for her. She traveled with her father to state dinners. She sat beside him at a private audience with Pope Pius X in 1908. The lesson, never spoken, was that the face a family shows the world belongs to whoever is willing to build it, and that person accumulates a power the public never gets to audit. Then came the wound she carried into her 90s and surrendered to tape. During her junior year of high school, Rose had been accepted to Wellesley, an extraordinary honor for an Irish Catholic girl from her neighborhood. Her father quietly enrolled her at the convent of the Sacred Heart in Manhattanville, instead, and sent her on to Blumenthal in the Netherlands for finishing. When the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin asked her, late in life, what her single greatest regret had been, she expected answers about assassinated sons. Rose answered Wellesley. 3 of her children would be killed. 1 would be destroyed on an operating table in a story we'll come to. The wound she finally surrendered to the tape recorder was a school she had not been allowed to attend. Read that for what it tells you. The woman who would outlast every Kennedy man had been shaped by the same 20th century, and the first lesson was that her preferences were negotiable. The man she married was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, the second son of a Boston ward politician who had crossed into banking. Rose had known Joe since childhood summers at Old Orchard Beach in Maine. Honey Fitz had resisted the match for almost 7 years. In his view, the Fitzgeralds held office and the Kennedys held ledgers. What broke his resistance in 1914 was the title on a letterhead. Joe had just been installed, at 25, as president of Columbia Trust, and his press described him, without irony, as the youngest bank president in the country. The letterhead was the qualification. The man was incidental. The wedding was on October 7, 1914, in the private chapel of Cardinal William O'Connell, the same archbishop who had steered Rose away from Wellesley a few years earlier. Around 75 people filled the room, and that number was the message. Honey Fitz had once put his daughter's high school graduation on the front page of every Boston paper. He filled a chapel instead, deliberately, because the marriage was happening in defiance of his approval. And by the autumn of 1914, Honey Fitz was in no position to throw a bigger party. In late 1913, he had become entangled with a young cigarette girl whose nickname was Toodles, and his political enemy James Michael Curley had begun hinting at a public lecture on great lovers in history. Fitzgerald had withdrawn from the 1914 mayoral race officially for his health. Nobody explained. Nobody confessed. The family absorbed the humiliation by refusing to discuss it. Rose was 23. Watching her father survive a public sexual scandal by simply not speaking about it, and the playbook she pulled out of those weeks would run for the rest of her century. When the family is exposed, you do not explain. You keep walking forward, and you make the photograph say what you need it to say. What each of them walked into that chapel buying was specific. Joe bought the most socially valuable Irish Catholic woman in Boston, a woman trained since adolescence to walk into a room and own it before anyone else could. Rose bought out from under a father who had just dictated her college and would, given time, dictate her husband, and into a man who was loudly going to be rich. She had grown up watching her own mother absorb such treatment in silence. She had known the script she was marrying into, and she intended to perform it. The early years ran on rails. The first house was on Beale Street in Brooklyn. Joe Jr. arrived in 1915. John, later Jack, in 1917. Rosemary in 18. Kathleen in 20. Eunice in 21. Patricia in 24. Robert in 25. Zhang in 28 and Edward in 32, 9 children across roughly 17 years, with the first 4 born in that small Brooklyn house. Rose ran the household with the discipline Blumenthal had installed, and she had begun, by her own later account, maintaining meticulous private notes on each child, weights, illnesses, dental work, vaccinations. The fact is verified across multiple biographers who saw the records, though the formatting is described variously in the surviving accounts. The system was practical in a household that size, and it was also something else. The same habit that had weighed the McKinley White House moment against the prettier sister now turned inward on her own children. She was also absent from large parts of the household by rules she did not author and could not rewrite. Mothers of that era spent 3 weeks in bed after delivery, and Rose heard the rule absolutely. She arranged for every newborn to be baptized within hours of birth in small family gatherings, which she, on the later audio tour, said she had not attended, because the sacrament was not negotiable and her own body was. 9 children received into the church she organized her entire existence around, and she was not in the room for any of them. She said it as a scheduling fact. Readers have called it cold. It was also by the standards of the family she had been raised under normal. If this kind of slow burn American history is what you're here for, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because the next episode pulls another family apart the same way and reads what the textbooks folded shut. Joe was gone from the beginning in the way rich husbands were gone in those years. At the wedding, he had been earning roughly $10,000 a year. By the time the family moved from Brookline to Riverdale in the mid-1920s, he was a multimillionaire and on his schedule. In 1927, he put them on a private rail car to New York because Boston's Protestant establishment was never going to let an Irish Catholic family in, and he was finished asking. She had no house that was hers and no money that was hers and no profession she could call her own. For a devout Catholic woman married by a cardinal, divorce was not a hard option. It was not an option at all. Around 1920, pregnant with Kathleen and 3 small children at home, Rose left Joseph Kennedy and went back to her father's house in Dorchester. She stayed about 3 weeks. Honey Fitz did not console his daughter. He told her, in substance, that she was a Catholic woman in a Catholic marriage with Catholic children and that she would go back and make it work. Take in who was speaking. The man granting this lecture had recently destroyed his own career over a cigarette girl, and his family had agreed not to discuss it. He was not handing his daughter a moral principle. He was handing her the family operating manual. There was no door on the left. Rose walked back to Joe and began managing. She did not surrender. She reorganized. For the rest of the marriage, she built a life that ran parallel to Joe Kennedy's rather than inside it. Daily mass at a schedule she controlled. A separate bedroom arrangement by mutual design. Enormous amounts of travel. She crossed the Atlantic again and again, sometimes for months, leaving the children behind. Several scholars who have worked through her papers at the Kennedy Library have noted a sharp pattern. She timed most of those absences for periods when Joe would be at home. She had, in other words, made herself the permanent staff of a household he visited, and she made sure periodically that he had to do the job himself. That was not the behavior of a woman who had surrendered. That was a woman with one lever, learning when to pull it. While she was in Europe, Joe was in California, and by the end of 1927 he was no longer pretending. He met Gloria Swanson over lunch at the Savoy Plaza in November, signed a deal with one of the biggest stars on earth, and over the next 3 years ran an affair and a business relationship that helped destroy her savings, her studio partnerships, and her standing in Hollywood. In 1929, Joe brought Gloria Swanson to Europe on the same ship as his wife. There are photographs of the three of them. Rose entertained her in public and was photographed with her. She did not declare what she felt. In 1938, Franklin Roosevelt sent Joseph Kennedy to London as ambassador to the Court of St. James, the first Irish Catholic appointed to that post, and Rose, finally not sharing a season with a movie star, was extraordinary at the role she had been rehearsing since her teenage years. She was presented at court. She kept a Windsor Castle scrapbook that still survives in her papers. Her daughter Kathleen became the debutante of the season. The arrangement looked, from outside and possibly from inside, like the success she had been building toward. It ended because Joe Kennedy ended it. He was an appeasementist, and he said so aloud. By late 1940, he was telling an American newspaper that democracy in Britain was finished. He resigned under pressure. His political career, the entire reason for the money, was over in weeks, and it was over because of his own mouth. Nothing was freed for Rose. The collapse transferred the family's ambition onto the sons and made her public life more necessary, not less. Joe could no longer be the candidate, so he became the machine, and Rose became the machine's most credible product, the Catholic mother of 9, the mayor's daughter, the ambassador's wife. Every rule the family wrote from then on would be written in her name. The first great test of that rule book was her eldest daughter. Rosemary Kennedy was born in September 1918 at the peak of the influenza epidemic. The family story passed down through the years held that the doctor had been delayed and the baby held back in the birth canal, which would have implications we will come to in a moment. That account is family recollection rather than medical record, and it should be held loosely. What is uncontested is that Rosemary developed more slowly than her siblings, never caught up, and inside a household organized around winning became a quiet administrative problem. She was pretty. She was sociable. She did genuinely well at convent schools in England using the rote discipline her mother had been steeped in. Letters she wrote to her Irish chaperone during those years, kept quietly by the chaperone's family into the 1960s, show a young woman describing trips and asking for friendship. Back in Washington in her early 20s, she grew agitated, then distressed, and by late 1941, she had become unmanageable. Her father authorized a prefrontal lobotomy, performed by Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts at George Washington University. Watts, defending his work decades later, described guiding the procedure by having Rosemary count and recite as he went. She was 23. The surgery went catastrophically wrong. She lost most of her speech. She could not walk unassisted. She required full-time care for the remaining 64 years of her life. Her father had not told her mother the procedure had been scheduled. Rose learned it afterward. That single fact is the most damning item on the record about Joseph Kennedy. And what Rose chose to do with it is the most damning item on the record about her. Rosemary was placed at Craig House in New York and beginning in 1949 at St. Coletta in Jefferson, Wisconsin. Joseph Kennedy never visited again. Rose did not visit for almost 20 years. The younger children were not told where their sister was. The public was told, across the years, that Rosemary was teaching, that she was at a convent, that she was living quietly. She had been mutilated by her husband without her mother's consent, and her mother's response was to enforce the silence. You do not discuss it. The family goes on. The method worked, which is exactly what her father had taught her it would do. Then, in the spring of 1944, Rose's second daughter made a decision that pulled every unwritten rule into view. Kathleen, called Kick, had fallen in love with William Cavendish, the heir to the Duke of Devonshire, an Anglican to the bone. The children of any such marriage would be raised Church of England, and that was not negotiable on his side and not negotiable on her mother's. On May 6, 1944, Kathleen Kennedy married William Cavendish in a civil ceremony at the Chelsea Register Office in London. The guest list included the Cavendish family, a crowd of London society names, and exactly one Kennedy, Joe Jr., who was in England with the Navy and walked his sister into a ceremony his mother regarded as apostasy. Rose did not attend, and she did not permit the family to attend. Now place those two facts beside each other. This was a woman whose husband had once put her on the same ship as his mistress, and she had protected him. And here she was deploying the same machinery of money, name, religion, and silence against a 24-year-old whose offense was marrying a man she loved during a world war. The system that had trapped Rose did not soften her. It made her fluent in the language of force. Billy Cavendish was killed by a sniper in Belgium in September 1944, 5 weeks after they had last been together. Joe Jr. was already dead, killed in an air mission over the English Channel the previous month. Kick lost her husband and her brother in a single summer. She stayed in England. By 1948, she had fallen in love with the married Earl Fitzwilliam, and Rose's response, by every reliable account, was an ultimatum. End it or the family would end her. In May 1948, she was flying south over France with Fitzwilliam to make one more appeal to her father when their chartered plane went down in a storm over the Ardennes. She was 28. Joseph Kennedy was the only member of her birth family at her funeral. She was buried at Edinburgh in the Cavendish churchyard under the line the family she had married into chose for her. Rose did not go to England. The documented behavior is more than enough on its own. Later, second-hand accounts hold that Rose framed her daughter's death as divine punishment. Those come from interested parties decades after the fact, and we can put them in the file without leaning on them. The part that is on the record does not need their help. Rose Kennedy did not attend her daughter's wedding, and she did not attend her daughter's burial. For 15 years after the war, the family story went in one direction, up. Senate seats, the White House, the most photographed family in the country. Rose campaigned through thousands of teas across Massachusetts. She was the mother of the first Catholic president. She was extraordinary at being herself because she had been in rehearsal since 16. Then, in December 1961, her husband suffered a major stroke at the age of 73 in Palm Beach, was paralyzed on his right side, and largely lost his speech. For the remaining 8 years of his life, until he died at Hyannisport on November 18, 1969, at the age of 81, he could not finish a sentence in public. He could hear what was being said about him. He could not answer. She was 71. She had another 34 years.